Religion has profoundly influenced the sweeping American narrative, perhaps more than any other force in our history, from the time of the indigenous peoples to the present day. The National Museum of American Religion tells the surprising and compelling story of what religion has done to America and what America has done to religion, including the establishment of the revolutionary and indispensable idea of religious freedom as a governing principle in the U.S., inviting all to explore the role of religion in shaping the social, political, economic, and cultural lives of Americans and thus America itself. Join us for Season 3 of our podcast series, Religion and the American Experience, as we follow scholars and others deep into America's religious history and learn how it can inform and animate us as citizens grappling with complex questions of governance and American purpose in the 21st century. Episodes will be released monthly on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Listeners, welcome to another episode of Religion and the American Experience, a podcast of the private, digital-first National Museum of American Religion, which explores what religion has done to America and what America has done to religion. Please follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, or wherever you get your listening fix, and tell your colleagues, friends, and family about us. Rock and roll is a well-known musical genre in the United States and throughout the world. Many of us, including me, grew up with it, and with the understanding that some adults, especially our religious leaders, were at least wary of it. And I was a teenager in the 80s. Needless to say, rock and roll is a solid part of the American narrative. On this episode, we will explore the ways religion, specifically Christianity, interacted with it. This will be fascinating. We have invited Dr. Randall J. Stephens to help us understand how Christianity reacted to rock and roll. Dr. Stephens is professor of American and British Studies at the University of Oslo and is a historian of religion, conservatism, the South, environmentalism, and popular culture, and is the author of several books, including The Fire Spreads, Holiness and Pentecostalism in the American South, and The Devil's Music, How Christians Inspired, Condemned, and Embraced Rock and Roll. Dr. Stephens received his BA in History at Mid-America Nazarene College and his PhD in American History from the University of Florida. Randall, thank you so very much for being with us today.
Well, thank you for having me.
Randall, why did you write this book? How did it come about?
Well, I was very interested in the topic of pop music and rock, and I was in a band in the 90s that had some releases, and I also did some music journalism for different magazines and newspapers, did a lot of reviews and things like that. But on my first book, The Fire Spreads, about Southern Pentecostalism, in the latter part of it, I came across these facts that were new to me, and that was that many of these Pentecostals who grew up in the South, who were, the first generation of rock and rollers, who either grew up in these churches or had close connections to them. And I thought, this is a really interesting story to tell. And it had been told in different ways before in articles, but no one had treated that kind of interaction of what we think of as like secular rock music with churches, and also the development of what is called Christian rock. So I wanted to trace these intersections over time, and it was a world I was familiar with in a way, even to the extent of, as a young man, like many people who were in evangelical or traditional churches, I witnessed youth preachers that would come through kind of crusading against rock and roll and would warn us as young people about the music. And so there was part of that story that was academic, and it went back further in time. But even though I wasn't writing autobiographically, I knew something about it from my own personal experience.
Right. I felt somewhat the same way in reading it. I remember a couple of church meetings in the 80s where the leaders would talk about some of the evils of rock and roll. It wasn't super emphasized, but I do remember a couple. So it was there for me as well. So thank you for that. That's interesting. We're glad you wrote it. That's for sure.
Oh, thanks.
So let's begin here. First chapter, Origins of Rock and Roll. You quote Elvis, and here it is, quote, "We used to go to these religious sing-ins all the time. There were these singers, perfectly fine singers, but nobody responded to them. Then there were these other singers. The leader was a preacher, and they cut up all over the place, jumping on the piano, moving every which way. The audience liked them. I guess I learned from them singers," close quote. So, Randall, tell us what we need to know about Pentecostalism and perhaps a short description of what Pentecostalism is for our listeners and the relationship there with rock and roll.
Yes. Yeah, thanks for that question. So I want to argue in the book that the culture of Southern Pentecostalism helped give birth to the new genre of rock and roll. And I was really pleased to get this review by Califasana, a music critic, and he described my book as being about a kind of family struggle within this, religious community about the origins of rock. And so I land on, the Pentecostalism, tongue-speaking churches that focused on healing, and churches that had this music that was different. It was more revved up. It was more exciting to many of its participants. So, and in some ways, the story of the anti-rock and roll crusading and the negative reaction of churches, I think, has obscured that a little bit and made it seem like rock had very little to do with religion, and churches in these early years had very little to do with rock. But my point is largely that Southern Pentecostalism really shaped first-generation rock and rollers and people who were in the genre of rhythm and blues and also soul. So figures like Elvis Presley, Johnny Cash, Little Richard, Jerry Lee Lewis, James Brown had experienced these churches firsthand. So even before the new music creates a real stir, church leaders and lay people are arguing that the relationship and the boundaries between pop music and church music is that there's a problem there about that some of these performers are borrowing from or even stealing from religious music. And that would be the case, with Ray Charles or Jerry Lee Lewis, who was part of a Assemblies of God church, which is the same that Elvis comes from, and just borrowing really directly from church music. So in the case of Ray Charles, he used a song by this group called the Southern Tones for his song, I Got a Woman. And when you listen to the two of those together, it's very close. And Charles even, was quite frank about that. So part of the argument I make is that the boundaries between these worlds weren't as kind of fixed and firm as maybe believers would have thought that they were. To give just one example about Elvis, we started out with that quote from him and about his inspirations. When Elvis was a teenager, he, really aspired to be in one of these Pentecostal vocal groups. And so he tried out for one that was called the Songfellows in Memphis. And he didn't make the cut because the leader of it thought that he couldn't harmonize well enough. Now, long before that, decades before, Pentecostalism emerges largely from this revival that takes place in Los Angeles in 1906. It's an interracial revival at a time when America is very segregated. And so it's led by a black preacher from Louisiana named William Seymour. And at this revival, the participants think that they are experiencing the age of the Spirit, like that you read about in the New Testament book of Acts, even as far as speaking in tongues and writing in other languages, playing instruments that they'd never played before. So there's these accounts of that. And so some of these enthusiasts, even when they went to the South, they like to talk about how the color line was washed away in the blood of Jesus. And this was ushering in a kind of a new world and even the millennium or the end of times. The interracial component largely fades in the coming decades, but there's elements of that we even see with these first generation rock and rollers and a kind of integrated music that's borrowing from all these different traditions, religious and otherwise.
Okay. So was Elvis a practicing Pentecostal when he was growing up?
Yeah, he was. So he when his family moved from Tupelo to Memphis in the late 1940s, they went to First Assembly of God, which is pastored by James Hamill. And so there's accounts of Elvis being kind of like a country boy his clothes didn't fit very well. He seemed awkward, but he was a regular at the church and went to Sunday school. And he and his friends, sometimes they would sneak out of church and go across town to an African-American church to participate or be in the back of it to kind of witness it. But they had to do so in a kind of clandestine way.
Right. So it's hard for me to imagine a preacher jumping on the piano and moving all about, but this is an accurate description of some of what happens in mid-20th century Pentecostal churches in the South?
To a certain degree. It probably wouldn't have been quite as animated as that. But, in Memphis, I mean, Elvis witnessed some of the best of these groups, white groups like the Statesmen and Stamps Quartet. But he was also really into African-American groups as well, like the Golden Gate Quartet and some others. And he was always, when he would do interviews, which he, tended to not do too many of after he felt kind of burned from the earlier ones, he would usually mention that those kinds of groups that inspired him. And Little Richard, was really into this singing evangelist named Brother Joe May, who was called the Thunderbolt of the Midwest. And he had kind of a wild stage persona. And some of these rock and rollers were even styling their hair like them and wearing the kind of suits that these quartets would don, and mixing that up with other sorts of things.
Okay. So definitely a connection, some friction from the churches that some of these early rock and rollers had stolen, appropriated some of their music, probably not their lyrics. I'm guessing that the lyrics are different. These aren't church songs, but to the music and sort of the way they performed a bit. Okay, so we got that connection, 1950s. Tell us, so you write in the book also about, well, let me quote a handbill that you talk about in the book that warned about the evils of rock and roll in the 50s. And we're going to bring in some of the race issues here. Quote, notice, stop, help save the youth of America, don't buy Negro records, close quote. So we know that there's opposition to some of this rock and roll from the white community, but here we're talking about, from any community, just because of the nature of the music and the words. But here we're going to see, hey, there are some actual race issues coming up. Can you tell us about how race, and you mentioned a bit about the Pentecostalism, how that had some integration there, but how does race connect with rock and roll in the 50s?
Yeah, that was one of the more interesting, I guess disturbing also, chapters to write was about this. So one of the chapters focuses on this widespread racist denunciation of early rock and roll because it's integrationist, because it's elevating Black performers like Chuck Berry and Little Richard. And if you extend it to rhythm and blues, other areas, there are others as well, like Bo Diddley and B.B. King. And the term jungle music was often used as a kind of shorthand to denigrate the music, as it had been done too with jazz and with blues before. And you'd also hear denunciations of jungle rhythms, and people, like concerned white people in the South especially would be writing editorials about this. So this all comes to a head and is more powerful as a narrative against the music because of teenagers, because rock and roll was such a widespread teenage phenomenon among Black teens and white teens. So one of the episodes that I focused on in that chapter was when Bill Haley and his Comets came to play in Birmingham, Alabama, a segregated city, in 1956. The same year that the Montgomery bus boycott is taking place, led by Martin Luther King Jr. And so when Bill Haley arrives there, the White Citizens Council and members of the Klan organize this protest of the show. And they're shouting, jungle music at the performers as they're entering the venue. And they're picketing the venue with placards that read, like, quote, why Negro music, down with bebop, Christians will not attend this show. And then another one was, bebop is communism. there's some confusion of the terms there because bebop is associated with jazz, of course, performers like Charlie Parker, but they weren't really into the subtleties of it. And then one of them as well, another one of these signs read, "Ask your preacher about jungle music." And there's real fear among these individuals and even people who aren't part of the Citizens Council or the Klan that, rock and roll and dancing and these performances is going to lead to race mixing, which is a constant kind of fear among white supremacists. And in religious circles, that language about jungle music is being talked about within the discourse of missionary activity abroad. So there was a Baptist, a concerned Baptist writer who I discovered who was talking about these things. And in 1957 wrote, quote, "On Main Street and in African jungles, the beat of this wild rhythm is the same." So there's a lot of language and fear about degradation of culture and of sort of bringing down sort of this pristine white civilization to this lower level. And it's just chock full of that kind of language.
Okay. So there were probably, I remember in the book, there were other criticisms, religious criticisms of rock and roll in the 50s that did not bring in the race element, right? Can you share some of those and how pointed they were, how significant they were?
Yes, yeah. And it's an interesting kind of asymmetry here because, Elvis, Little Richard, Jerry Lee, they talk really fondly about their religious upbringing. And in the case of Elvis, his mother Gladys was a committed Pentecostal Christian. But that those feelings aren't mutual, and these churches denounce these figures as soon as they have a level of fame that, they're known across the country. But from the early days of his stardom, Elvis's pastor is talking about Elvis and the problems that this life of sin, for him, are introducing. And I came across these letters between James Hamill from Elvis's church to the head of the Assemblies of God, one of the heads of the denomination. And Hamill, Elvis's pastor, said that, of course, Elvis can't attend church anymore because he's so famous, but he's really caught within a web of Satan. So there's, among a lot of religious figures, and this is true for different eras of rock history, it's that these individuals are involved in kind of deprived behavior. Their music is lewd, and it celebrates a sensuality that is certainly not Christian. Yeah.
Okay. All right. That sort of matches my understanding as well from reading the book and otherwise, and some of what I experienced growing up, what I heard. Okay. So we're going to move into the 60s. And you wrote this at the end of the chapter before the Beatles come to America. Quote, "By the early 1960s, worries of a miscegenationist, anti-religious rock and roll revolution were slowly subsiding." So all these things we just talked about sort of ebbing a little bit. The public, the press, and even teenage fans tended to consider rock and roll a Black roots phenomenon. So, Randall, can you help paint a picture of rock and roll as the 50s ended and the 60s began?
Yeah. This is an interesting kind of periodization, of the music. And just like we, have kind of a timeline of American religious history, in some ways that overlaps with rock music and popular music. And one way to think about that first generation of rock and roll is it's a kind of wave that crashes in on itself. And there's, a kind of discontinuity in a certain sense. So you have some who died, like Buddy Holly and the Big Bopper, or others who fall victim to scandal, sexual scandal, and that's Jerry Lee Lewis and Chuck Berry. Or you have others as well who stop playing entirely because Elvis goes into the military, and then Little Richard goes into the ministry, and that's when Little Richard is on tour in Australia that he does this. So the album charts in the late 50s and early 60s change a bit, and there's kind of a partial cleaning up of the image of rock and roll. And that's also a product of scandal about pay for play, the scandal called payola. So you have a new type of celebrity star. Some of them are these baby face crooners like Ricky Nelson, Fabian, Frankie Avalon, Pat Boone. And then you also have so-called girl groups like the Ronettes, the Shangri-Las, the Cookies. And then there's the surf music craze, and a kind of surf music and car music, which one critic said that they were writing love songs to the carburetor, which I thought was quite fun. There used to be a real kind of a sense that this was a decline in pop music, like that was the story of it. Maybe that was more in the 1970s and 80s, but critics now take this period much more seriously. So like Lucy O'Brien writes about the girl groups, for instance, and you have others who are reassessing this period between that first generation, Elvis and the rest, and then the Beatles in 1964 when they come to the U.S.
Okay, which we will get to.
Mm.
Was the story of Little Richard becoming a preacher a big one? I don't think our listeners probably know much about that.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think it's 1957. I might be wrong about that, but it seems like it's right around then. And when he does this, it appears in a lot of newspapers around the U.S. and also in the music press. So I found this great recording. It was an interview that Little Richard was doing in Australia with an Australian DJ. Little Richard is talking about Sputnik, up in the heavens as a sign of the end of the world. And the Australian DJ just doesn't know what to do there on the spot, how to make sense of it. But in an effort to kind of convince people that he was serious, Little Richard took off some of this jewelry that he had and he threw it into a river in Australia. So he was, that was a loss of money, but he lost all this money. And I believe he was sued by some of the venues where he was slated to play. And then, of course, he comes back to perform in the early 60s, and he goes on tour in the UK with the Beatles, actually, before the Beatles were really known in the United States. And they were, especially Paul, they were huge fans of Little Richard.
Okay. And so what was his reasoning for going into the ministry? Was it a call? Did he say, I've been called, I feel the call, or I'm just tired of this rock and roll and its degradation? What was his...
Apparently, according to one story, that he was confronted by a door-to-door preacher, and Little Richard grew up in the Seventh-day Adventist church, and so that's where he went into ministerial training because of that. But, I still think about writing something about this in the future because, these early rock and rollers had such a sense of guilt in certain periods at certain times that was really gargantuan. And Little Richard was certainly part of that. Like he was kind of hounded by a sense of guilt, and he would go, he would sort of, it was kind of ebb and flow, his religious life. And Jerry Lee Lewis was like that. And of course, if we extend it more into rockabilly and country, Johnny Cash was like that as well, which there's a lot of drama around that for them.
Yeah. Okay. And any religious connections with these crooners, these end of the 50s, early 60s groups, the surf music, any religious connection there or not much?
Well, certainly with Pat Boone, who, Pat Boone goes on to become a prominent evangelical Christian, an ally of Ronald Reagan. And the connection there as well is, of course, Pat Boone does a cover of Tutti Frutti, which does quite well in the charts and sells well. And I think that was always a kind of thorn in the side of Little Richard. He would talk about that occasionally. When you see the two of them side by side performing Tutti Frutti, it's quite different. These authors, Kovacs and Flory, write about Pat Boone kind of whitening up the song quite a bit or whitewashing it for a larger audience.
Okay. All right. So thank you, Randall. Let's get into the 60s. So here's how you set the 1960s rock and roll table for the readers of your book. Quote, the conservative Christian response to Beatlemania from 1964 through the 1966 Bigger Than Jesus controversy sheds light on how the faithful came to engage pop culture and reveals something about the culture wars that ensued, close quote. So there are some important stories and through lines here, Randall. Can you help our listeners understand the religious responses to the Fab Four, including what the American religious landscape looked like in the 1960s as you go through this?
Yeah. I wanted to talk about just what a massive phenomenon Beatlemania was in these years and how it really was unavoidable for all sorts of different Americans. You know, whether you hated the Beatles, despised them, just thought they were weird. Like when my parents saw the Beatles on Ed Sullivan in February 1964, I remember they told me they didn't know if it was kind of a practical joke because it seemed so odd that they seemed to have hair like Moe from the Three Stooges. It couldn't register in a way to them. But, along with Elvis, the Beatles were such an important pop cultural phenomenon that even relatively cloistered religious people, conservatives, were responding to them, were in some cases horrified, were commenting on the kind of tight clothes they wore, how that they had girlish hair, and they produced so much kind of a hysteria among fans, and especially young women fans. There were stories about the front row at their concerts would smell like urine because fans would get so excited that they would urinate there. And McCartney, there's a funny video of McCartney actually being asked about it and awkwardly responding to that phenomenon, almost like it's like sort of religious ecstasy that these fans are participating in. Later, critics like Barbara Ehrenreich has written a little bit about that. But there's also the issue of the Beatles kind of taking the place of religion, the sort of excitement that they represent for young people. So I found this worried Sunday school teacher saying he felt like some of his young people in his Sunday school knew more about John, Paul, George, and Ringo than they knew about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Like that it would maybe lead these youngsters down this other path and away from the church. So I use that in the book as a kind of pivot point to talk about how in 1965, 66, there's more interest in engaging with this kind of music. There's a British group who are in the Salvation Army called the Joy Strings that sing kind of folk music, but with the twinge of Mersey Beatle stuff. And it's a very early kind of version of Christian rock. So you see the earliest sort of experiments with it in the wake of Beatlemania.
Okay. Were there any denominations or religious voices in America that were silent or embraced the Beatles and Beatlemania?
It was fun to kind of look at that and see that, more kind of moderate or even liberal Protestants, for instance, and also Catholics, were in some cases sympathetic about the Beatles and, were even talking about their films like Hard Day's Night, which comes out in, I think, August 1964. So it isn't all kind of outrage and denunciation in moral terms. It's also some groups are trying to think about what you can learn about young people by the career and the success of the Beatles, of sort of trying to understand or kind of use them to unlock the mystery of the teen mind, I suppose.
Right. Okay. And as far as borrowing any musical traditions and bringing them into their music, like Elvis and the early rock and rollers, did the Beatles have any of that? Is there a connection between Beatles music and religious music?
There is, but it's kind of a secondary or even tertiary. Okay. Like, for instance, McCartney, when he has that high-pitched kind of woo that he does, I'm trying to think if there are particular songs, like when they performed at Shea Stadium in 1965. But he's borrowing that directly from Little Richard. And Little Richard actually was borrowing that directly from a well-known Black gospel woman, a gospel singer that I'm blanking on her name right now. But it's like that influence sort of travels through rock and roll first generation in America. And then the Beatles themselves, kind of like the Kinks and the Rolling Stones and the Who, were so into these bands that were part of that first generation. We're so obsessed with figures like Chuck Berry or Little Richard or Jerry Lee that it kind of makes its way through a sort of serpentine route.
Yeah. And I'm sure, I'm not sure, but I can imagine that all music has some ties to religion, right? Because I think music is very much part of religious life.
Yep.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. Well, before we leave the Beatles, can you tell our listeners about the Bigger Than Jesus controversy? It was big, right? Very big. It was, and what was it and what was its significance?
Yeah, this was one of the biggest religious stories of 1966, along with when Time magazine had this cover issue of, God is dead, and thinking about death of God theology at the time. So Lennon, I believe it's in the spring of 1966, he does an interview with Maureen Cleave for a British newspaper. And Lennon is talking a little bit about Christianity. He's recently read a book called The Passover Plot. And he makes this offhand comment that, Christianity will go. And he says, Jesus was fine, but the disciples were thick and stupid, something to that effect. And he said, the Beatles now are more popular than Jesus for teenagers. He later said that that he was talking more about the kind of post-Christian, or what was becoming a kind of post-Christian Britain, than about the United States. But that didn't really matter. That story gets picked up by a teen magazine called Datebook. And the historian Brian Ward has written about this. And then it makes its way into the American media. So in August of 1966 is when it really explodes. And that's when the Beatles are on tour throughout the United States. So when they play in Memphis, for instance, there are representatives of the Klan who come there. There's a bomb scare taking place. And the Beatles were hounded by the press to try to, explain this. So they were asked over and over. It was almost like an apology tour that they made. And it's one of the reasons why, their last concert in Candlestick Park in San Francisco, after that, they don't tour anymore. And there was part of that, at least, that was because of all of this controversy and how miserable it was for them, and how they'd also just sort of grown out of touring, and they were doing things in the studio with the album Revolver that you really couldn't replicate with primitive technology on stage.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Let's see. I wanted to ask you a few questions about civil rights leaders and their reaction to rock and roll. And this was in the 60s, I think, when you quote Andrew Young and then also Martin Luther King, although I'm not sure at the time. But anyways, you quote civil rights leader Andrew Young saying that rock and roll did more for integration than the church. This is quoting him. And if I was going to choose who I was going to let into the kingdom, I might have to choose Elvis. Close quote. What is the story here, Randall?
Yeah, this was just one of those really just a golden kind of primary source because it seemed so rich. And it was the historian Paul Harvey was the one who pointed me to this. But what I like about it is it shows these sort of interconnections or the weaving together of race, religion, and pop music. And so Young himself, Andrew Young, was, of course, a close associate of Martin Luther King Jr. He was executive director of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And then he was later a congressman and a United States representative to the United Nations under Carter. And he's speaking here to a group of young activists in the civil rights movement. And he's making a good point. I mean, rock and roll music played on the airwaves or in concerts, it's bringing together young Black and white people in the same kind of audience or within the same listenership. You have Black operated stations like WDIA in Memphis that are playing African American music that young white people are listening to, and that can't be segregated. You can't segregate the airwaves. You can't sort of hive off the kind of music that young people want to listen to. And I think it's especially fascinating to think about something that seems really apolitical having a kind of political or at least a strong cultural impact on youth in America. And that seems to me what, Young is trying to get at. And you see it too in these early performers like Bill Haley. He recounted at one point, he said, and I quote him here, he said that he performed to mixed groups all over the country and have watched the kids sit side by side, just enjoying the music while being entertained by white and Negro performers sharing the same stage, close quote. And that would be true with Haley. It's also true with Fats Domino, with Little Richard, and with others who are in this integrated environment. Even if in the South they're playing to a segregated audiences, it still breaks things beyond that.
Right. So that's a pretty strong statement from Andrew Young, saying rock and roll did more for integration in the church. Yeah, I mean, we'll just let it sit there like that and have our listeners contemplate that. Interesting story. I also found it fascinating that Martin Luther King disliked rock and roll, writing at one point in Ebony magazine, quote, "The real question is whether one can be consistent in playing gospel music and rock and roll music simultaneous. These two are totally incompatible." What should we take from this, Randall?
Yeah, I think it's a really good example of, just the widespread fear about the music, about it being degenerate, about it being lower class. And especially before the mid-1960s when rock music is starting to be viewed more as a kind of art form and has kind of, even with Motown as well, it's like appealing to a broader audience and having a different kind of resonance in the public. In these early years, it was largely dismissed. It was made fun of. Elvis is described at one point as looking like, with his tight clothes, like he's stuffed like a sausage performing on stage. There's this view of, Elvis kind of slithering out of the swamps of the South. So it has a kind of negative public image, and it's not taken seriously. But and then even too, there's reporting in the media in the 50s about riots that accompany rock shows or that accompany the showing of films like Rock Around the Clock. So in a sense, I mean, Martin Luther King, he really is like a lot of other ministers, black and white, in these views about the music. Right. But whether he would have changed in the coming decade, I don't know that, but I imagine maybe he would have.
Yeah. So he was in that quote speaking as a religious leader, Reverend Martin Luther King, and not really commenting on what Andrew Young saw.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So let's roll into 1969. Everybody's heard about Woodstock. So we have the Beatles in the mid-60s. We have rise of the 60s rock and roll scene. You have Woodstock. Now tell us about the 1972 Godstock, which I had never heard of until I read your book and what it represented. And maybe, I think we all know no religion in Woodstock, maybe. Or maybe there was, but Woodstock is not considered tied to religion, traditional religion, right? So tell us about Godstock.
Yeah. So Godstock is this large concert festival that takes place in Dallas in 1972, and it gathers about 200,000 people there. And there are adults that are there, of course. There's teenagers, there's youth leaders who are taking part. And to me, it represents this sort of acceptance of the counterculture in baptized form. And the stage itself is all like these really bright kind of primary colors. It looks like almost like a pop art Peter Max painting or something. So Dallas's streets are clogged at the time with these Jesus hippies with long-haired teens wearing bell-bottom jeans and beads around their neck. Bearded Pentecostal youth pastors wearing kind of tattered clothes and sandals. And it did have some well-known performers who took part, and ministers as well, like Billy Graham, the evangelist, was there. So he gave it sort of the imprint of the evangelical establishment. Johnny Cash was there and performed. Chris Christopherson took part. Barry McGuire. But then there were a lot of lesser-known, newer Christian artists like Andre Crouch, Love Song, Great Commission Company, and then a performer from Godspell, the musical. But it's really, it's hardcore evangelical. They have this vision at Godstock Expo 72 that they're going to reach the United States for Jesus 4 years later in 1976, and then the entire world by 1980. So it's enlivened with this very optimistic message of the gospel, wrapped in the clothes of the counterculture and the kind of look and feel of the counterculture.
Very fascinating. This was evangelical, so definitely there were churches and denominations and faiths that weren't part of that, didn't participate.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And was it, I like how you described that, this was the embrace of a particular denomination or set of denominations of the counterculture that we see.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And you have, in those years too, you have like churches that are sponsoring coffee houses where you have like Christian folk performers coming, or Christian rock groups. And some of the earliest sort of energy of this is in California, around Los Angeles and in the Bay Area.
Really? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. Randall, you write about a 1969 band called Mind Garage from Morgantown, West Virginia, what you call, quote, perhaps the first Christian hard rock fusion, close quote. What is Jesus rock? And who are the big players in this genre, and how significant was it? Or is it?
Mind Garage is quite obscure, but made an impact, or made a splash at the time in doing this kind of hard rock or psychedelic rock as a kind of liturgy in even church settings. So at Trinity Episcopal Church in 1967, they performed this loud, revved up, distorted music. And then at Princeton in 1968, you had like 1,000 people or more coming to these shows. They were written up in the Village Voice positively, not made fun of by that kind of taste-making publication of the counterculture. And then RCA actually released their self-titled album in 1969, and it's distorted, it's heavy, it's muddy, it's fuzzy, and it has the kind of the imprint of the Doors, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Big Brother and the Holding Company, Jefferson Airplane, and then lesser known kind of heavy bands from that era. And they, I think they're really kind of pioneers because this is quite early in the music. But then you have in the coming years, and especially by the early 70s, a variety of new groups, artists like Phil Keaggy, who was in a band called Glass Harp, that really sounds like Paul McCartney, is an excellent guitarist, starting to perform and to release albums around the country. And then by 1980, the year that Reagan is elected president, there probably are around 500 groups and artists that are, in the Christian music industry, and especially Christian rock, that are touring around the country. And then you have this whole world of goods that goes with that: merchandise, shirts, paraphernalia, and then the records themselves. So by 2001, if we fast forward in time, it's now CCM, or contemporary Christian music, is $1 billion industry and probably represents about 12% of the total music industry. So it's gone from the obscurity of the Mind Garage era, and there was another band from this period called the Crusaders really early on, to becoming this, massive phenomenon with record labels, with, Christian book and music stores all over the country, with massive festivals like Cornerstone in Illinois, and, spreading through teen groups and through churches, etc.
Okay. Now, I did, I guess, jump forward to Godstock in 72, and then I went back to 1969, Mind Garage, and we had this discussion.
Yeah.
What you just described is that, where does Godstock fit in? Is that part of it, or is that sort of a separate thing?
No, it definitely is part of it. And it's really there's so much energy in the early 1970s within the church and within these religious communities, but also there's kind of this like seeker spirit or a renewed sort of interest in Christianity that you see in other ways, like you see it on Broadway with Jesus Christ Superstar, or with Godspell, even with songs that make it onto the charts. It seems like there's a kind of like a Jesus fever that's taking place in the 70s, maybe in reaction to some of the experimentation of the 60s.
Okay. Now, I want to hear from you the fundamentalist reaction to Christian rock, or maybe broader, including that, what were the religious responses to Christian rock besides the positive responses of those that were generating it?
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, on one hand, that's right. Like you're saying, there's an acceptance of this music in many circles, in many evangelical communities. Like in the tradition I grew up in, the Church of the Nazarene, there was a kind of embrace of it and a support of certain kinds of Christian rock, like you'd be hearing it at youth gatherings and stuff like this. But among fundamentalist, separatist, independent churches, independent Baptist churches, within other kind of conservative Pentecostal communities, there was just a total rejection of it. Like it was viewed as a caving to some of the worst parts of pop culture. You can't make this music, you can't make it palatable within a Christian context. So that reaction among fundamentalists is really fierce. And so like in the 70s and 80s at Bob Jones University and at Liberty University, you even had within their rule books, admonitions about not being able to listen to Christian rock or secular rock as well. And eventually, Liberty University under Jerry Falwell makes its peace with the music and changes that. But a place like Bob Jones in South Carolina is just dead set against it. And with all of this agitation, you have some of these kind of pastor entrepreneurs who are going around the country speaking to groups about this. These are like Frank Garlock, David Noble. One of my favorites is David Noble, who said that the Beatles were sort of secretly trying to trick young people into becoming communists or soften them up for a communist invasion by using rock as hypnotism. And then even further, when we get into sort of weirder stuff, Jacob Aranza and others said that this rock music had secret satanic messages if you played it backward on your record player. So it was backmasking was in there. And that's kind of part of this stew of saying, rock is twisted and devilish. And even, if it's played with better intentions and with Christian lyrics.
Okay. That is interesting as I contemplate sort of growing up in the 70s and 80s and what I was listening to, what my church leaders said we should listen to or shouldn't listen to, or if they were silent. So that's really interesting. Can you tell us a little bit about, so you did describe, you went up to 80s and then the early 2000s with this Christian music industry that is very large and lucrative.
Mm.
How has that infiltrated, a bad term? How has that moved into some churches, part of their services, and how has that not with others? Can you help us understand that story?
That's a very interesting story. And my colleague, Leah Payne, has written a really good new book about some of this, taking it up into more recent years. But, since the 1970s, the influence of charismatic Christians and Pentecostals, especially with music, has been a really powerful force with choruses taking the place of hymns, and with in much more recent years, with the kind of music that you hear in mega churches and in just, regular churches, some of them non-denominational, that has the feeling of a rock concert and is at least is aiming for a kind of professionalism with a setup of drums, guitars, bass guitar, even in some cases an orchestra, and with singers, who are professional or a quasi-professional. There's a huge contrast here. Like if you went into a Wesleyan church or a Church of the Nazarene in the 1970s, and, if you hear the kind of music they're doing then compared to today, it's quite different. So I think that is also sort of a product of Christian rock, that it has sort of, while the industry itself of Christian rock and of the music and of CDs and everything has declined, the sort of praise and worship world has climbed quite a bit. So some of the big stars today that are actually on Billboard, like Frank Forrest, I think was his name, and Brandon Lake, who are social media stars, are within, this sort of worship world or adjacent to it.
So you're saying that Christian music has declined in popularity in the broader world?
In a certain degree, it has. This is something that Leah Payne writes about. I mean, especially compared to the early 2000s. Okay. When you think about things like Christian bookstores, even some big chains that have closed, shut their doors, some of these really huge festivals that once drew together thousands and thousands of fans don't exist anymore. Like Cornerstone is one of those that stopped. And just it could also be related to, like, younger people now. According to Pew polling, there are a lot of young people who are religiously unaffiliated. Like maybe the music just doesn't have a natural audience that it had before. Okay. So there's all these different factors to kind of measure it.
Right. But at the same time, it has grown in churches themselves.
Yeah.
You were saying, right? Okay.
Yeah.
In some, in many, but not in all, right? Definitely.
No. Yeah.
Some had avoided it and not integrated it, and some have.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Good to think about, fascinating to think about. Okay, so as we conclude, Randall, I'll ask you the same question I ask all my guests. Do you want to share any lessons or takeaways here at the end from the topic, either in terms of important historical transformations you are charting, or in terms of helping us better understand our present moment in the American narrative?
Yeah, thank you for that. When I was doing this book, I was trying to think about, ways that are, well, they're quasi-political, but they're also pop cultural, that, the impact of, say, evangelicalism or Pentecostalism, which there definitely is a lot of work that's about, really good work that's about family life and about politics, or even partisan politics or politicization. But I wanted to talk about the pop cultural components of these believers in these communities and the meaning of that, which I tried to do. I don't know if I was successful or not, to sort of extend what we think about these worlds into other realms than ones that we've had more kind of attention focused on. And then, thinking about the first part of the book, about the porous boundaries between the church and between sort of presumptive secular realms that I wanted to track within the lives of those early rock and rollers like Elvis, Jerry Lee, Little Richard, Johnny Cash, and others. That, we have these sort of tidy ideas of categories. And I think that this music, rock and roll, which is one of America's most important kind of soft power exports, had some of its roots firmly planted in this new religious movement that was really exciting to these performers and inspired them in many ways.
Right. Pentecostalism.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, you have the last say there, Randall. Thank you. We have been listening to Dr. Randall Stephens, professor of American and British Studies at the University of Oslo and author of The Devil's Music, How Christians Inspired, Condemned, and Embraced Rock and Roll. Randall, thank you so much for giving your time to help us understand the religious thread in the tapestry of rock and roll. I hope you've enjoyed the time with us as well.
Thank you very much for having me.
The podcast series Religion in the American Experience is a project of the National Museum of American Religion. Episodes will be released monthly on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.